Hello, class, and welcome to This Week in Forensic Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie. This week we're going to be taking a look at abductions, and we're just primarily going to be looking at case studies related to abductions. And we're going to have some particular focus on the psychological aspects behind these crimes, because abductions are some of the most harrowing crimes we can study, often very deep rooted in psychological dysfunction and driven by some very complex motives. Now, while Hollywood and the media may sensationalize abductions, today we're going to dive into some of the realities behind these cases. I just want to kind of start with you to kind of just reflect a little bit. How do you think abductions case play out? What is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear about an abduction? Is it fear or confusion or curiosity? How might the victim feel in such a situation, and what kind of psychological impact could it have on them and their families? Now, abductions can range from child kidnappings to the deeply disturbing cases of fetal abductions, where the fetus is forcibly taken from a pregnant woman. Now, as we explore some of these things, I want to just kind of remind you that there are some deeply emotional things here. So when we take a look at this lecture today, as always, I want to start off with a little story about an expert, and then we're going to dive into three main themes. The first one is just looking at a survey of the different types of abductions, from child kidnappings to familial and non-familial abductions, to the rare but disturbing phenomenon of fetal abductions. And understanding the type of abductions will provide a framework for exploring the psychological profiles of the perpetrators involved in each type of crime. And we'll also examine the motivations behind these actions. Whether they're driven by mental illness or a desire for control or social and environmental pressures. Next, we'll turn our attention to how the legal system handles abduction cases. So we'll look at the legal, medical, and forensic considerations. And we're going to focus in here on fetal abductions. And this case is going to dive into the forensic medical processes used to determine the cause of death, injury, and trauma, as well as how these findings are used in legal prosecutions. And then we're going to look at some specific cases, a few fairly famous cases. These real-world cases will allow us, hopefully, to explore how forensic evidence and psychological profiling all kind of came together and coordinated law enforcement efforts to contribute to solving these cases. So as we begin, I want to introduce you to Mickey Pistorius, who is a very well-known South African criminal profile and psychologist who made significant contributions to the understanding of violent criminals, including abductors. And Pistorius is often regarded as South Africa's first and most well-known psychological profiler, with her insights playing a crucial role in many high-profile criminal investigations. Now, Mickey Pistorius was born in South Africa and was initially trained as a journalist before she transitioned into psychology. She did get her degree in clinical psychology and did her doctoral dissertation on serial killers, which kind of laid her groundwork for being a criminal profiler. She joined the South Africa Police Service in the early 1990s and became their lead profiler in the investigative psychology unit there. During her time in the South African police force, Pistorius was involved in the investigation of a number of abductions, as well as many of which were linked to serial killers and other violent offenders. And she developed a fairly robust framework for understanding the psychological motivations of abductors, particularly in cases involving children and vulnerable victims. And she was informed by her training, obviously, in forensic psychology, but also her understanding of culture and societal factors that would influence these crimes. And so Pistorius is well known as somebody that is a prolific writer. She wrote a few famous books, one called Fatal Females, another one called Catch Me a Killer. And so if you are ever interested in this field, I would recommend Mickey Pistorius's work as a wonderful place to start. Now, let's kind of get a lay of the land for abductions. Abductions can be very complex. There's lots of reasons for it, and there are different forms for it. Each of these forms has their own distinct psychological and legal and social implications. So understanding the variety of types is essential, I think, to developing psychological profiles of the perpetrators and then effectively investigating these crimes. So to kind of start off with, we have stranger abductions. And stranger abductions involve basically what it says there. It involves the kidnapping of a victim by someone with no prior relationship to them. And these cases often evoke the greatest public fear because typically the society feels like they cannot protect themselves against this type of thing. And there's a number of different types of stranger abductions. First off, there's sexual exploitation abductions. In many cases, the abductor seeks to sexually exploit their victims, often targeting children or vulnerable adults. Then there's human trafficking, and some abductions are tied to organized crime networks that exploit individuals for labor or sex trafficking purposes. And occasionally there's ransoms. Kidnapping for ransom are typically well planned and involve holding the victim in exchange for financial gain. Though this type of abduction is more common in some specific regions in the world. But it can occur anywhere, theoretically. Now, abductors may kidnap individuals in order to exert control, and that seems to be a lot of the psychological need for the motivation for this type of abduction. And often it stems from some deeper seated psychological issues. There are also familial abductions, where a family member, most often a non-custodial parent, takes the child without the legal right to do so. And these cases are often the result of disputes over custody or parental rights. And so a parent may abduct a child in reaction to a court ruling or to prevent the other parent from having access to the child. And this type of abduction is usually driven by emotional conflicts such as anger, revenge, or an obsessive attachment to the child. And there's some significant impact here because familial abductions can be emotionally traumatic for the child, who may feel torn between parents and very unsure of their future. And the legal interventions here often aim to resolve the custody conflict, but long-term psychological effects on the child can typically be very significant. There are specifically child abductions, and these are among, again, the most distressing, where a minor is taken without their parents' consent. And while some child abductions fall under stranger or familial categories, others may be more complex, involving individuals who seek to adopt or raise the child as their own. And there are things like issues of pedophilia and exploitation. So many child abductions are motivated by pedophiles seeking to exploit their victims. And some abductors are driven by an overwhelming need to have a child, especially if they are unable to conceive or have suffered a miscarriage. And these individuals may abduct children to raise them as their own. Then there's human trafficking abductions. And abductions for human trafficking purposes are a global issue, with victims taken in order to be exploited by labor or for prostitution or for illegal activities. And this form of abduction is usually organized by criminal syndicates, and the victims are often transported across borders. And the targets are often vulnerable individuals, including women and children and migrants. And victims of human trafficking often experience severe psychological trauma, such as PTSD or depression and anxiety, due to the prolonged abuse and exploitation. Then there is fetal abductions, and this is a particularly gruesome and rare form of abduction, where the perpetrator forcibly removes a fetus from a pregnant woman's womb, often resulting in the death of the mother. And this type of abduction is usually driven by an intense desire to have a child, often rooted in psychological disturbances such as delusional thinking, or the belief of a false pregnancy, where they try to convince people that they are pregnant when they're not. And we'll dive into this a little bit deeper in the next section. There's also political and terrorist abductions, because in some cases, abductions are carried out for political or ideological reasons, often by terrorist groups or insurgent organizations. And these kidnappings may be intended for, say, for example, for political leverage. So hostage taking in exchange for political demands, or the release of imprisoned members of the group. And the intention here is to instill fear and control. So groups may abduct individuals to create fear and maintain control over certain populations, such as journalists or aid workers in a conflict area. And the goal largely is publicity. So very high-profile kidnappings are sometimes used to attract media attention and publicize a group's cause or grievances. And then there are sometimes virtual abductions, because in this digital age, the new form of abduction is virtual abductions. And in these cases, criminals falsely claim to have kidnapped someone and demand a ransom from the family, while in fact no physical abduction has taken place. But the emotional toll on the family can be very severe, and they are led to believe their loved one is in danger. Now, we're going to take a little bit of time and explore a little bit about fetal abductions. As I mentioned, this is a particularly rare and horrific form of abduction in which a perpetrator forcibly removes a fetus from a pregnant woman's womb, often resulting in the death of the mother. And these crimes are often premeditated and carried out by individuals with some severe psychological disturbances, including the delusions about pregnancy or the desperate desire for a child. And fetal abductions stand out not only due to their extreme violence, but also because of the intense psychological motivations behind them, which can often involve some serious mental health conditions and usually a lot of delusional thinking. Now, if we're to define fetal abduction as a crime, it's because there's the removal of the child from the womb. And this is basically a violent, forced cesarean section. And such a procedure is going to be life-threatening, and there's a life-threatening risk to the fetus as well. Now, we need to kind of distinguish here a little bit between cesarean abductions and other type of abductions. Cesarean abductions differ from other abductions in that they specifically target the fetus and require direct, often lethal physical harm to the mother. So unlike other abductions where the perpetrator takes an already born child or person, fetal abductions center on a criminal's desire to steal an unborn child by removing it from the mother's womb. And the violence and invasive nature of these acts makes it particularly brutal. Now, fetal abduction cases began to be documented more frequently in the late part of the 20th century, but the crime is still exceedingly rare. And fetal abductions are typically prosecuted as both a homicide and a kidnapping, given that they often result in the mother's death and the unlawful taking of the fetus. So if the mother is killed during the abduction, the perpetrator is charged with murder. Depending upon the legal framework, they may also be charged with the murder or unlawful killing of the fetus. And once the fetus is quote-unquote born alive and taken from the scene, the crime transitions into a kidnapping offense as well. So if the mother survives but is severely injured, there'd be charges like aggravated assault or attempted murder would be applied. Now, fetal abduction presents this very unique challenge. There's the interpretation of when a fetus is considered a living being varies by jurisdictions. So this is going to also affect how charges are filed. But in all cases, this is still a very horrific kind of crime. Now, I want to kind of just tell you a little bit of a story of Bobby Joe Stinnett, who's one of the most infamous examples of fetal abduction, capturing some global attention because of the brutal nature of the crime and the loss of a young mother. And this case illustrates the intent of premeditation, the role of forensic evidence, and the psychological complexity behind the crime. Now, in December 2004, Bobby Joe Stinnett, 23-year-old from Missouri, was 8 months pregnant when she was murdered in her own home by Lisa Montgomery. Now, Montgomery, if you can see a picture of her there on the right, was a woman who had faked pregnancies and was desperate to have a child. And so she carried out this very grisly fetal abduction by strangling Stinnett and then forcibly cutting the fetus out of the womb. And Stinnett and Montgomery had initially connected through an online forum for dog breeders. Montgomery had pretended to be interested in purchasing a dog, using this interaction in order to arrange a meeting in Stinnett's home. But unbeknownst to Stinnett, Montgomery had devised a plan to steal her baby and raise it as her own, having told family and friends that she was pregnant. So on December 16th, 2004, Lisa Montgomery visited Bobby Joe Stinnett's home, where she strangled her until she lost consciousness, and then Montgomery used a kitchen knife to perform the cesarean section, cutting out the baby, and leaving Stinnett to die from her injuries. Now, Montgomery took the newborn and attempted to pass it off as her own. And the investigation into Bobby Joe Stinnett's murder and fetal abduction quickly moved due to the availability of the forensic evidence. There was online communication and a lot of effective police work. And critical to the case was the DNA evidence that linked the abduction to Bobby Joe Stinnett. And this proved that Montgomery was not the child's mother. And Stinnett showed clear signs of a violent struggle. And the nature of the wounds made it clear that her baby had been forcibly removed. Now, Montgomery, remember, had contacted Stinnett through an online chat room under a false identity, but investigators were able to trace the communications, which provided clear evidence of the premeditation. And these digital records were really crucial in identifying Montgomery as the prime suspect. And family and friends of Montgomery testified that she had had previous false pregnancies, and then she would suddenly had this appearance of a newborn child, which raised some suspicion. And you combine that with the horrific murder of Bobby Joe Stinnett, and that brought a lot of family and friends to raise concern about this as well. So when looking at the psychological profiling and police coordination, really kind of saw that the profilers suggested that the perpetrators in cases like this would likely be a woman who had recently lost a child or had experienced multiple failed pregnancies. So this insight helped to narrow the suspect pool. And on top of that, there was some coordination across multiple jurisdictions, which enabled law enforcement to track Montgomery down just a day after the crime had been committed. So during the trial, Montgomery, it was claimed, suffered from severe mental illness, including false pregnancies and post-traumatic stress disorder related to childhood abuse. She was found guilty and was sentenced to death in 2007. Now, after years of appeals, Lisa Montgomery was executed in 2021, and becoming the first woman to be executed by the federal government in the United States in nearly 70 years. It was a pretty significant case. And Bobby Joe Stinnett's family and the surviving baby girl, Victoria Joe, are left to cope with this immense psychological trauma of this crime. The loss of the mother, the violence of the crime, the long-lasting emotional and psychological effects on the child, and the whole community in Missouri really will last a lifetime. Now, let's look at some of the motivations of fetal abductions. They may be rare, but they are very disturbing, and so it's important to look at one of the most common motivations for fetal abductions is the perpetrator's desire to fulfill their maternal identity. They want to be known as a mother. And many perpetrators will struggle with infertility or with miscarriages or having lost a child in the past. And so they feel a deep psychological need to assume the role of mother, which can end up manifesting itself as an obsession with pregnancy or childbearing. And so these individuals believe that having a child will provide them with the acceptance, love, and social status that they crave. So let's just kind of take a look at that a little bit. There's that pressure to conform to societal norms of motherhood in society that can drive women to extreme lengths, especially in societies that emphasize children and child rearing as a key role for women. And so perpetrators may view having a child as a way to fulfill their emotional void. It's a way to seek validation or a sense of purpose through motherhood. And there's the delusional thinking that goes along with that believes that they are entitled to a baby, either as part of a delusional fantasy or due to an overwhelming belief that they are destined to be a mother. Now, fetal abductions are premeditated, and perpetrators typically will plan the crime over weeks and months. But on occasion, there are impulsive moments or extreme psychological breaks. But in cases of premeditation, the perpetrator typically will stalk an expectant mother and gather information about her pregnancy and her routines in preparation for the crime. So in the case of Bobby Joe Stinnett, Lisa Montgomery posed as an online acquaintance before attacking Stinnett. But there are those rare cases where someone just has poor impulse control and their overwhelming desire leads to the crime, but these tend to be very much less organized and more spontaneous. Now, there are some social and environmental factors that play into this, like infertility, loss of a child, psychological stressors that push an individual toward the fetal abduction. And these experiences can cause feelings of inadequacy and failure or grief, which may lead to extreme actions. And the perpetrator often rationalizes their crime as a way to replace the lost child or compensate for their inability to conceive. So women who struggle with infertility may experience feelings of shame and guilt and inadequacy, especially in cultures or families where having children is highly valued. And sometimes there's recent miscarriages or stillborns. So the trauma of the loss of a child in utero can also lead some individuals to act irrationally, seeking to replace the child through the abduction. Now, in some cases, perpetrators are driven by external pressure from romantic partners or family members to produce a child. And this pressure can lead them to commit these extreme acts in order to hold on to that social standing or that relationship. So family expectations, partner pressure can be factors, significant factors as well. Now, when we look a little bit more deeply at the psychological characteristics of the perpetrators, a few things tend to stand out. Fetal abductors tend to demonstrate narcissistic traits. They tend to have an inflated sense of self-importance. They need to be admired, and they tend to have a lack of empathy. So the abductor may feel entitled to the child and view themselves as deserving of motherhood, regardless of the harm that it causes to others. And a common trait among these perpetrators is also the inability to empathize with the victim, focusing solely on their own needs and desires. There's also sometimes psychosis or delusional thinking, and having a history of child loss and pregnancy. So there's unresolved grief. That deep sense of grief over the loss of the child may motivate some abductors to attempt to replace that lost baby. And there's also tends to be an obsession with having a child and an obsession with pregnancy, so much so that there's fabricating of pregnancies, pretending to be pregnant, wearing padded clothing to mimic the appearance of pregnancy, and wanting to be around women that are pregnant, targeting expectant mothers. A few red flags would be some of those things, but also having inconsistent pregnancy claims. When family and friends and partners notice inconsistencies in the perpetrator's pregnancy claims, such as a lack of prenatal care, no doctor's visits, or a suspiciously short pregnancy term, these would be things that profilers would want the public to know about, to bring the public in on helping to identify a possible perpetrator. So in doing the psychological evaluations for someone like this, it typically involve clinical interviews, psychological testing, a review of the perpetrator's mental health history, and assess for psychoses, delusional thinking, personality disorders, particularly narcissistic personality or antisocial personality disorder. All of that would go a long ways. Now, I want to kind of just highlight another case that was fairly traumatic just for me, just because I lived in the area back in the 1990s. I was close to my home in Chicago, and it was the case of Deborah Evans, who was 28 years old. She was 9 months pregnant at the time of the attack. She'd lived with her children in an apartment in a suburb of Chicago in Illinois, Maywood, Illinois. And in 1995, she was attacked and killed, and her fetus was cut out. But her 10-year-old daughter and her 7-year-old son were also killed, but her 17-month-old was left and survived. Now, this is a kind of a unique case because shortly thereafter, some people were arrested. And here we see just a little bit of what went on here. Jacqueline Williams was the lady that was arrested, along with her boyfriend, Fidel Caffey, and a third accomplice. And what they'd done is worked as a team to invade the home and abduct the child and kill these children and the mother. Now, some of the psychological profile of Williams was that she did display these narcissistic personality traits. She had this sense of entitlement. She believed that she deserved the child, this regardless of the consequences. And her decision to fake a pregnancy and then brutally kill another woman to obtain the baby seems to reinforce this grandiose sense of self and a belief in her desire that it was justified by any measure. She also had this obsessive desire for motherhood. Williams was driven by an obsessive desire to be a mother, and this desire was then intensified by her relationship with Caffey and her need to maintain the facade of a pregnancy to satisfy herself and others around her. And her obsession with motherhood overwhelmed any ethical boundaries that played into this. In this case, there was premeditation, there was lack of empathy. And this included premeditation for the selection of the victim and the decision to kill witnesses. And all of that underscores Williams' complete disregard for the lives of others. Now, when it came to solving this case, there was some DNA testing that confirmed that the newborn belonged to Deborah Evans, and this linked the child to the crime and proved that Williams and her accomplices had abducted the baby after killing Evans. There were some key witnesses, including neighbors, that had seen Williams in the area and testified to this, and that helped to kind of narrow down the suspect list. And it also raised suspicion regarding her pregnancy claims. So in 1998, several years later, these three individuals were convicted of murder, and they were all sentenced to death. But at the time of this recording, I believe that that was not carried out. In fact, I think it was commuted to life in prison without parole, as the state of Illinois subsequently abolished the death penalty. But I hope you see here that there's a lot of trauma here. The one remaining child was left, clearly, would be left with not only the loss of the family, but severe psychological trauma. The loss of the mother, the loss of siblings. All of this can't help but being of harm to them. And just speaking as somebody from the community, I know me and my family were impacted significantly by this, and we had no connection with any of these people, but just the fact that it happened, within a short distance of where I lived, made us all feel very uneasy and wary of neighbors. So that's a little bit of abductions and the psychology of abductions. So a few key terms for this lecture. What is a fetal abduction? It is the crime of forcibly removing a fetus from a pregnant woman's womb, often resulting in the mother's death or severe injury, and where the perpetrator typically aims to take the fetus and raise the child as their own. And this form of abduction is exceedingly rare, but because of its physical violence and the severe psychological disturbances, it is something that is noteworthy. One of narcissistic personality traits. That is one of the characteristics of this. And some things that tie in with this would be a grandiose sense of self-importance, a sense of entitlement, sense of lack of empathy, a need to be admired. And in the context of fetal abduction, these traits may manifest as a belief that the perpetrator deserves a child and is justified in taking the extreme measures that they do to fulfill this desire. So, what is a common psychological motivation for fetal abduction? Well, this is a pretty straightforward one. It's the desire to fulfill a maternal identity. And this is the most common psychological motivation, the overwhelming desire to assume the maternal role. And this is often driven by feelings of inadequacy or infertility, or the need for social acceptance or admiration by others as a mother. So that's it for our lecture this week. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.